Hello friends and welcome back to another October reading video. Today we're reading H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Mr. Teddy Hen Fairy's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfield, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," he said, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed with him, and then noticed he had his bag and hit upon a brilliant idea. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," she said, "I'd be glad if you'd giveth old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. 'Tis going, 'tis going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem. This is with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signs, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the sancti vigis of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled, and but for a second. It seemed to her the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was a sensation for a moment. The white bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and his huge yawn below. And then he stirred, staring up at his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly. With the muffler held to his face, just as she had seen him hold the severity before, the shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from her momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, startled, staring round in a dozing manner, and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake. "Certainly." Miss Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Hen Fairy entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him as Mr. Hen Fairy says in a vivid sense of dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Hen Fairy, that it's no intrusion." "None whatsoever," said the stranger, "though I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Milly Hall, "you preferred the clock," she was going to say, mended. "Certainly," said the stranger, "certainly, but as a rule I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen too," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Hen Fairy's manner. Very glad. Mr. Hen Fairy had intended to apologize and withdraw, but the anticipation reassured him. The stranger stood around with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. And presently, he said, when the clock mended is over, I think I shall like to have some tea, but not until the clock mending is over. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfairy. When her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst, she told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. You are certain this is the earliest, he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. I should explain, he added, what I was really so cold and fatigued to do before that I am experimental investigator. Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. And my baggage contains apparatuses and appliances. Very useful things indeed they are, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and I'm naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries. Of course, sir, my reason for coming to Imping, he proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner, was a desire for solution. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work, in addition to my work on accident. I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself. Necessities a certain requirement. My eyes are sometimes weak and painful. I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together, lock myself up sometimes, now and then, not at present, certainly at such times. The slightest disturbance, my entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and if I might make so bold as to ask, that I think it's all, said the stranger, with the quiet, irrestrainable air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Miss Hall had left the room, she remained standing in front of the fire, glaring to Mr. Henfield. Glaring, so Mr. Henfield puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfield not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracting the works. He tried to work in a slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamps close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame of the wheel. He left the rest of the room shadowy when he looked up. Colored patches swarm in his eyes. Being constitutional for a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still it got Henfrey nervous. He felt alone in the room, and looked up, and there, gray and dim, was the bandaged head and a huge blue lens staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny looking to Henfairy that for a minute they remained startling blankly at one another. Then Henfield looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something should he remark that the weather was very cold for the time of year. He looked up as if to take aim with the introductory shot. The weather, he began. Why don't you finish and go, said the frigid figure, evidently in the state of painful suspense rage. All you've got to do is fix the hour hand in its axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. One more minute. I overlooked, and Mr. Henfairy finished and went. But he went off feeling excessively annoyed. Damn it, said Henfairy to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. A man must do a clock at times, sure lie. And again, can't a man look at you, ugly, and yet again, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more roped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner, he saw Hull, who was certainly married the stranger's hostess at the couch and horse, and who now drove the imping convenience when occasionally people required it to Sherbrings Junction, coming towards him on his return from the place. Hull had evidently been stopping a bit at side bridges to judge by his driving. "How do, Teddy?" he said, passing. "And you got a rum-un-up phone," said Teddy. Hull very solidly pulled up. "What's that?" he asked. "Rum-looking customer stopped at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My snakes." And he proceeded to give Hull a vivid description of the grotesque guest. Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it?" "I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henbury. "But women are that trustful. Where strangers are concerned, he's took your rooms, and he ain't ever given a name, Hull." "You don't say no," said Hull, who was a man of sluggish appreciation. "Yes," said Teddy, "but by the week, whatever he is, you can get rid of him. Under the week, he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow. So he says, let's hope it won't be stones and boxes, Hull." He told Hull how his aunt at Hagging's had been swindled by a stranger with empty Pomtuexes. Altogether, he left Hull vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hull. "'Tis, I suppose I must be 'bout this." Teddy shrugged on his way, with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing 'bout it, however, Hull on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild injuries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to be to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall. In spite of these discouragements, "You Wim don't know anything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guests at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little computationally a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall. "And I'll mind mine," she said, all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusual, strange sort of stranger. But she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of interminable necks, and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. And that's the end of chapter 2. So, friends, tune in next week for chapter 3. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and also follow us on social media at the Funky Play Bros and Funky Play Brothers. And it's tomorrow, not next week. Thank you for watching. Bye.